Welcome to Operant Conditioning and Observational Learning, where we will build on what we've learned on classical conditioning and see that these are more higher level or in some ways complicated ways of learning. They may not feel complicated to us, but as we'll find out, the cortical and brain structures needed to learn this way are more complicated and higher level. This and more to come as we learn about these topics. I think with these topics, we can see them play out in our lives a little bit more. We have better memories of when we learned these things and how we learned these things. So we'll do a deep dive into operant conditioning. We'll point out some similarities and differences from classical conditioning. And then we'll talk about observational learning briefly. This is something that we could really break down and discuss a lot, but it doesn't have a lot of key terms. And so we'll just do an overview of what it means to learn through observation, and also why it's important and how it's somewhat unique to humans and our close relatives in the animal world, and how most animals can't learn through this, what seems to us, a basic way of learning. A quick true and false as we get ourselves oriented to these topics. They might both seem similar in that they're negative or something bad is happening, but as we'll have to clearly distinguish, anytime there's reinforcement, we are trying to encourage that behavior to happen more often in the future. And when we punish, we are trying to reduce the likelihood that that behavior happens in the future. There's often a belief out there that children are more likely to imitate negative role models than positive role models. From observational learning, fortunately, we learn that this is not true. So what this means is that children can be exposed to bad role models and they're not doomed to repeat those negative behaviors, but we have to be conscious of the balance. And so that if children are behaving badly, that's evidence that they're not just seeing bad behavior, but they're seeing more bad behavior than they are seeing good behavior. So then we need to expose them to more positive behavior for them to model. This might seem initially as the best way to get someone to learn. Each time they show the behavior, we respond to it and reward it. But in fact, that's false. People tend to behave more rapidly and more consistently if the reward comes at more unpredictable times. We'll find out why that happens, but that has strong implications for situations in which we're rewarded in our lives, at school, at work, and otherwise. Punishment is a very powerful technique. Unfortunately, it doesn't have as predictable and consistent long-term effects. In fact, people are much more likely to learn that punishment happens in a given context, but oftentimes that association does not generalize to other contexts. So they learn just not to do that behavior that gets punished here, but it does not extinguish the behavior in general. You can train pigeons to peck a certain area to one stimulus and another area to another stimulus. You might have to do a lot of work to get them to do this, but through basic operant conditioning techniques, you can get fairly simple animals to look like they're showing higher order understanding. Of course, they would have to be taught on the specific songs. And so if you switched out one AC/DC song or Beethoven song for another one, that association may not generalize. So the pigeon doesn't understand on a higher level how AC/DC and Beethoven are different. They just have learned from those specific stimuli. There's a also somewhat common belief that Skinner raised his child in an operant or Skinner box, causing her to have psychological difficulties later on. This is false. Skinner did, outside of his operant conditioning research, create what he called an air crib, which was a special crib that was supposed to be a safer version of commonly available cribs, but it did not have levers and food reward chutes as some people think. But let's look at today's interesting thing. What influences our operant behavior? For example, punch cards, rewards clubs, The goal is for the company to get people to come in more often, and that is an operant behavior. How many times do you come into the store? How many times do you buy something? Now, think about two ways in which you might have a reward system. One would be the card has 10 boxes, and when you first get it, the boxes are blank. The other card would be 12 boxes, and when you get it, they maybe say, oh, we'll be nice, and we'll give you 2 clicks or 2 stamps this time. Then, does it make a difference in terms of when somebody fills up that card? How long does it take them to get the operant behaviors to get the reward? Now, of course, in this scenario, you have 10 more behaviors to do, but we find out that with the 12 box technique, since it feels like you've already made progress, you may experience or feel some momentum to be closer to the goal. And so what happens then, of course, is with this, if it feels like you're closer to the goal, you're more likely to go in more often to get that ultimate reward. But we'll step back a little bit and talk about the basic Skinner operant conditioning paradigm, and it involves rats pressing levers for food. So here is Skinner, and he came up with the process and the paradigm for talking about operant conditioning as we do. And it comes from a very simple belief that behavior is strengthened or more likely to happen in the future if it's reinforced. And you can have, as we'll talk about in a little bit, both positive and negative kinds of reinforcement. Or if you punish behavior, you can make that behavior less likely to happen in the future. And of course, there are positive and negative forms of punishment that we'll talk about. You can see when Skinner was active, and you can see that also when he was growing up, he was in the time of Freudian psychodynamic dominance in the human psychology field, and he was very much opposed to the psychodynamic perspective and created what's called Skinner boxes today, or these behavioral technology devices that can clearly control when the reinforcement and when the punishment happens. So here's an example of a basic Skinner box. These are still used very much in research today for animal research. You could argue that you could easily set up a Skinner box for humans, although I don't know of any specific cases where that's happened. So some of the features you can see are pressing a lever. That's the behavior that you want to see if changing the rewards or punishments can affect. You also have speakers that can function as stimuli to maybe cue this behavior. You also have an electrified grid. So this would obviously be a form of punishment. So if you wanted to get the rat to stop pressing the lever, you can start to shock it. And of course, the food dispenser. And you can also see that it's hooked up to computers where you can essentially set the program for the reinforcement or punishment schedule and then walk away the next day, check to see how many of the behaviors have happened, and maybe set a new program to teach the rat a new thing. So lots of different variations on this essentially simple setup that you can use. Another example would be for pigeons, you have to take a behavior that's somewhat natural. So of course, rats in the previous example, or mice, want to climb up on things and press things and use their feet. Pigeons, on the other hand, naturally want to use their beaks and peck things. And so of course, for the best operant conditioning, you want to take something that a pigeon naturally does, such as pecking. If you wanted to get that pigeon to hop up and down in response to certain stimuli, that would be more difficult. It would take more pairings and more time to teach that different response. And of course, sticking with this basic theme, you can teach rats to go through mazes incredibly fast through basic operant conditioning reinforcement techniques. So let's introduce some of the basic concepts for operant conditioning. First of all, we have the idea of reinforcers. These increase future behavior, and we can also break them up into the positive and negative variants. A positive reinforcer is something that we want, such as food, such as a pat on the back or a compliment. And when we behave, we expect to get that compliment, or we expect there to be a chance that we get that compliment. Of course, we can have a negative reinforcer. So this would be, for example, something that increases behavior when it's removed. So of course, if you're trying to reinforce studying behavior, you can ground that person, take away something good, and that only comes back when that studying behavior is increased. On the other hand, we can have punishers. These decrease future behavior. And I think the most common form of punishment, the one that comes to mind most likely, is the positive punisher. You add something bad to decrease the behavior. So for example, if you want to reduce the behavior of swearing or reduce the behavior of hitting your brother or sister, you can then, when that behavior happens, add the positive punishment. Introduce spanking, introduce yelling. The key is, I think parents should probably realize that there are negative punishers, and these might actually be more effective than the positive punishers. These decrease behavior when removed. So for example, you're taking away something annoying when that behavior stops. So of course, if you want to stop watching TV, your husband or wife, you would keep nagging, and only when that behavior decreases do you remove that negative stimulus. Now, these get a little picky, and I won't be asking you for positive and negative reinforcers come exam time, but I did want to just make you aware that there are different variants of the straightforward reinforcers and punishments. So what this means is that as a parent or as an educator or as a supervisor, you have more options than just the positive versions of reinforcements and punishments. So how does operant conditioning work? Well, first of all, you have to wait till that behavior that you want to reinforce happens. So, newborn babies don't smile. It takes a month or so. And of course, as parents, we want our kids to be smiling and happy and cute. So eventually, naturally, the baby will start to smile, and then the parent should be there, or caregiver, to start reinforcing. Oh, once little Junior Terrell smiles, now I'm going to give attention, tactile comfort, and then Terrell will then learn that through reinforcement, smiling gives me something I want, positive reinforcement. And so smiling will continue, but now that behavior is not just naturally happening. Now that behavior might be happening in part because it's paired with the reward or the reinforcement. We also have different ways in which reinforcement and also punishment can be doled out. So we have 3 different variations. And first of all, is it fixed or consistent, or is it variable or random? And is it a ratio based on the number of responses, or is it based on time, or as we'll call an interval? So going back to the rewards program we talked about earlier, we have the classic sub club, frequent flyer miles, rewards points, and of course those act as positive reinforcers. We want to get that reward. It's something that's motivating for us. And with the fixed ratio, we know that the more times we go to Subway, the closer we are to getting that free sub. And in fact, we could go to Subway 10 times today and we could get our free sub today. We are in control of the behavior with the fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. So of course, sales might be another example of fixed ratio. The more I sell, the more I get, the more bonuses I get. And the harder I work, the faster I work, means the faster I get my reinforcer, Contrast that with the variable ratio schedule, and here it is still based on the number of times that I do the behavior, but now it's variable in that I don't know I'm getting that reward after 10 subs, or spending $2,000 do I get my frequent flyer miles. Sometimes it might be buying 3 subs, sometimes it might be buying 20 subs. And of course, if we were asked, do we want something to be on a variable ratio schedule, most of the times we would say no. I want to know how many behaviors I have to do to get my reward. What's interesting though, and Skinner was a very big fan, I should say, in terms of this variable ratio schedule has a huge impact on our behavior. Because even though consciously we probably don't want our society to be set up this way, when things are doled out on a variable ratio schedule, we actually see a huge amount of behavior. And why? Because it seems to be related to sort of this addiction pathway that we've talked about before. So gambling, pretty much any form of gambling, you never know when that next hand is going to be a winner, right? Or the basic slot machine would be, you don't know how many times you have to pull that lever before you get your variable ratio reinforcement. All you know is that the more times you pull that lever, the closer you are to that winning the jackpot. So what this means is that if you know that sooner or later you're going to get reinforced, you're going to try and do as much of that behavior as you can. So for example, fishing, you never know when you're going to get that next giant fish and you get your picture in the paper. So if that's your goal, what are you going to do? You're going to try to keep going out as many times as you can, because that next time you go out might be the time that you get reinforced. Contrast that with now the interval combination. And in this case, we have a fixed interval, which means that we get our reward only after a certain amount of time passes. And since it's fixed, it means that that time is the same, or that interval is the same each time. So the classic example here would be pay by the hour. Now think about how this influences our behavior. We know that as long as we're doing essentially what we need to be doing, we're going to get paid, and we know exactly how much we're going to get paid. And in an 8-hour day, we know that's the amount of time that we have to work. So does this mean that we're going to be terribly motivated on the job? Does it mean that we're going to be trying to work as hard as we can? Well, if the compensation is only fixed interval, no, you won't be working as hard as you can. You're going to do what you need to do at a steady pace, because you know that working your butt off is not going to result in any more reinforcements. We also have the variable interval. This means that, yes, a certain amount of time has to pass before you get that reinforcement, but you don't know how long that interval is going to be, and it changes. So for example, think about something like getting email. Your behavior of checking the email does not have any effect on whether other people are going to send you emails. You can check a lot, you can check a little, and the emails are just going to come in when they're going to come in. So you can see that the variable interval reinforcement schedule sort of takes away your free will. Your behavior doesn't really matter because it's going to be at a random time when you get reinforced. So think about that in terms of fishing. Now this isn't the variable ratio as we talked about before, where you just want to keep going out as many days as you can. This would be, let's say you've got an 8-hour charter and you want to know when the next bite is going to come. Of course, all you can do is have your rods in the water, maybe have the right bait, but otherwise your behavior doesn't really control which fish is going to bite and when. So think about the responding, your behavior, your fishing behavior. You want to get your rods in the water, and then you want to be nice and patient and be waiting, because at any moment that next bite could happen. It could be within a minute, it could be an hour, it could be 5 hours, right? But you have to be fishing that whole time for that to happen. And of course, Whether you work super hard or whether you're just relaxing, it doesn't really make a difference in terms of whether the fish are biting, right? And so, of course, you're not going to work as hard as you can fishing because that intense behavior of working hard isn't going to be reinforced. So now let's put these all together on a graph, and you can see the clear difference in the intensity and frequency of the behavior is based on the key difference, whether it's a ratio or an interval, right? So of course the ratio, whether it's fixed or variable, in both cases we know that the more of the behavior we do, the faster we do that behavior, the closer we are to the next reinforcement. On the other hand, of course, interval, it's less about how hard or how fast we're working, it's more about time passing, right? Fixed interval would be, you know when the exams are coming up in class, and this might be study behavior, not much at the start of the semester. Once we get to our first exam, study behavior really increases, then drops off, and only starts to increase as we get closer to that next fixed interval point. Of course, another way to do this would be you don't have fixed exams, you just have pop quizzes. And think about how that would influence your study behavior. You don't know which next class is going to be the pop quiz and get the grade. So your study behavior would be pretty steady because you know you need to be ready for that next class and know your stuff. And once again, of course, most students would not like to have a variable interval study schedule, but if you're just looking from the instructor perspective and you want your students to be studying consistently, maybe it might be a good idea to introduce pop quizzes as part of the grade. So let's think about some examples in terms of how this plays out. Let's start over here with the classic pay by the hour. So many lower level or entry level jobs might have an hourly rate, and that would be what kind of schedule? Well, it's interval because it's based on time or hourly, and chances are your pay rate is going to be for each hour the same, 11 bucks an hour, for example, and so that is a fixed interval reinforcement schedule. Now think about maybe some other types of jobs. Let's say somebody is a mechanic or an engineer or a maintenance person, and they have to do maintenance on 10 machines a night. So in that case, it is fixed, but in this case, it's a ratio because it's not how long are you working, it is how many machines do you do a night. Once you hit your 10, then you've met your nightly pay requirements and you're good to go. And you would have some flexibility under this arrangement, this fixed ratio arrangement. You could work hard at the start and try to, get all your machines done and then sort of take it easy the rest of the night. Or you could sort of take it easy the first part of the night and then work really hard the second part of the night to hit your ratio, right? You have more control over when you do the behavior on the fixed ratio schedule. Now think of sales. So door-to-door especially, or Facebook, how many friends do you have to contact before you get one who's going to buy the product you're selling? And in this case, it is a variable ratio schedule because you don't know how many people you have to contact or knock on their doors until you make a sale. All you know is that the more you do the behavior, the more people you get in touch with online, the more people you knock on their doors, the closer you are to making that next sale. And of course, what do we see in the behavior? Variable ratio. Many people might not want that type of reinforcement, but it also factors into sort of this addictive pleasure center. So for example, some people want to keep doing this behavior because that reward of making that sale is so rewarding or enticing to them that they don't mind having to do tons of these behaviors to actually get rewarded. And then finally, think about the variable interval schedule. Almost no jobs are variable interval. Think about how weird that would be, that your behavior is not going to be reinforced at predictable times or numbers. So farming, you can farm really hard or you can farm lazily, and due to weather, climate conditions, your behavior may not have much impact on whether you have a good crop. And you also don't know when you can cash in that crop. It might be late July, it might be early August, it might be September. You just don't know, and a lot of the conditions are outside of your control. So what kind of behavior then do you see from a farmer? Well, you got to do the bare minimum, but there's not much you can do once you've got the crops in and you've done the best you can do. And so you have since it's so difficult to live in a job that has a variable interval reinforcement schedule, we have some sort of combination of subsidies, right? So that we have government money that goes to farmers to supplement them, because if it was just based on the crops they produced, it would be very difficult to make a living that way. And of course, in most jobs, you don't want to have all of one of these, right? If it's variable interval or variable ratio, what happens if you go 3 months without making a sale? Well, that job is not working for you anymore, right? Or what happens if you just do pay by the hour? You get lazy employees, right? So most jobs have to combine some sort of combination of these reinforcement schedules, right? So you'd have to build in to this fixed interval maybe a fixed ratio. For each customer compliment that you get a bonus, right? Or for sales goals or hygiene cleaning goals. Of course, this would be maybe you do get a bonus for each sale you make, but maybe you get at least a smaller baseline salary too, to supplement that. Let's see how we're doing. If you're paid every 2 weeks, that is a fixed interval. And if you're paid on commission for each pair you sell, each sale you make, you get a reward. That would be a fixed ratio. Here's where parents need to really keep in mind what they are reinforcing and what they're not reinforcing. So for example, if a child learns that if I wake up screaming and I get attention for that and I get to sleep in mom and dad's bed, the parents probably don't want to reinforce that behavior. They don't want their child waking up in the middle of the night and sleeping in the same bed with them. But what they're doing, though, is actually reinforcing that behavior. So there are many examples where parents might think they're reinforcing one behavior, but in fact, they're reinforcing a behavior they wish they wouldn't be reinforcing. Let's also spend a little time talking about specific example of punishment, because I think sort of like talking about the carrot and the stick, you need reinforcers, the carrots, and you need punishments, the sticks. I think many people don't apply punishment in the way that research supports the most. So of course it is something negative, whether it's taking away something good or adding something bad. It is also controlling behavior in a powerful way, but often powerful ways that we're not trying to do. So think about some of the problems with punishment. First of all, the punished behavior is not forgotten, it's just suppressed in that moment. And it can often not generalize to other situations. So people learn to discriminate between situations in which bad behavior, such as swearing, will get punished and won't get punished. It's also interesting to think about the pairing of punishment with aggression. Punishment should not be paired with anger or aggression. And I know it's hard because oftentimes you see this negative behavior and you want to punish it right away. And you can think about large-scale politics. Something bad happens and we have to punish right away. The problem is that if it's administered with aggression, right? So for example, a parent gets mad at a kid for swearing or breaking something and then delivers spanking while being angry, what we see is that not only are you punishing that behavior, but also the kid is learning observationally too. And so that child will learn that when someone gets mad, that's when they punish. And what we should show is that take a step back, calm down, and then think about whether the punishment will actually affect the behavior and only that behavior. And if so, then proceed with the punishment. We talked about how punishment might not generalize across situations. It could be the opposite, that it generalizes across too many situations. So for example, a parent that punishes all the time, or a child that has a teacher that's mean to them, for example, that could overgeneralize to other situations. So the child is fearful at home of punishment and then also behaves as if he's fearful at school. Sort of like a learned helplessness type of effect. And of course, punishment only tells you what not to do. I know when I do this, I get punished, so don't do this, but what should I do? And of course, you have to balance the punishment with reinforcement to lead people into desirable behavioral patterns. So you have to sort of combine or balance reward and punishment. And of course, authoritative parents will do this. And we have the example of the ultimate punishment, capital punishment. And it's interesting to think about, does it really work? Well, of course, if a person has one terrible behavior, a mass murder, and then they are sentenced to death, well, they can't really learn anything after that. So maybe you've created that association, but it's not going to affect their behavior anymore because they're dead. And do people learn maybe observationally through this? Chances are not. And also, with the criminal justice system, we have the sort of weird combination goals of both punishment and rehabilitation. And we need to think about, are those balanced? Because clearly the punishment is there, but do we have enough reinforcement so that when they get out, that we've shown them the right behaviors and reinforced those behaviors? So many complicated issues with our criminal justice system we could at least look at in terms of operant conditioning. And of course, when we pair operant and classical conditioning together, we see some similarities and some differences. Of course, the basic is, what is the response or behavior? It's usually something sort of automatic, a feeling of sickness or sexual arousal or fear with classical conditioning. Operant means you have to operate or behave voluntarily on your environment. The extinction process is pretty simple. Either stop presenting the unconditioned stimulus with classical, so stop presenting the food, and then the conditioned response will go down, although won't be extinct for long. And of course, with operant conditioning, you just stop delivering the reinforcer or the punisher. And of course, again, we have to start with naturally occurring behaviors and very basic ones with classical conditioning. With operant conditioning, we can get, for example, birds to jump up and down or climb up ladders, but it's going to be more difficult the more it deviates from their natural behaviors. And let's talk a little bit about observational learning. We can introduce Albert Bandura, one of the greats in the field and one of the nice guys in the field as well. Observational learning is essentially what it sounds like it would be, watching someone and then being able to do that behavior or learn something simply from watching. So Bandura was interested in the idea of modeling. Essentially, what kinds of models are children most sensitive to? And then, how can we present good models for pro-social or good behavior to generate more of that kind of behavior in our children? And again, the prevailing view in the 50s and 60s was that we need to censor bad behavior. we need to keep bad behavior off the TV so our children don't see it because they're especially likely to imitate it. But fortunately, what Bandura showed was that it's not just about censoring behavior. It's not keeping them from seeing the bad stuff. It is making sure they see more good stuff than bad stuff. And I think that's important for what kind of things do we watch on TV and in the news. It's not that hearing the F-bomb once or twice is going to cause our kids to start saying it, but if they hear it more than restraint and good language, well, sure, then they'll start modeling or imitating that bad language. And Bandura was behind the legendary Bobo doll study. A Bobo doll is essentially a blow-up doll that's weighted at the bottom, and part of how you play with it is hitting it, making it move, and bob back and forth. Now, in a classic experimental design, Bandura wanted to see if we show half of the kids a role model that is violent and showing some antisocial behaviors with the Bobo doll, will that group that saw the violent model, when we put them in that room, show more violent behaviors than the group of children who did not see the violent role model? And perhaps not surprisingly, that's exactly what Bandura found. The hypothesis was supported, that children who saw the violent role model were much more violent with this Bobo doll. All kids would smack it around a bit and hit it because that's what it's for. But those who saw the violent role model would see all these other toys in the room as not just toys, but objects to hit this doll with. And so you saw this, if I can bring up the video sometime, this sweet little girl in a nice little dress who's essentially sticking up this Bobo doll with a pretend gun. And of course, that behavior had to be modeled somewhere. And that's the important distinction too. The model in the video never used an object as a gun, but seeing the violent role model seemed to cue up that association in this girl, which means that sometimes models can cue up behavior that might have been learned elsewhere as well. Observational learning sounds very simple because humans naturally do it. We watch other people, we see how they act, see the consequences of those actions, and then we can observe whether we want to imitate that behavior or not. Although it doesn't seem special, it actually is very special in the animal kingdom, and most animals are not capable of hardly any observational learning at all, except with the exception of our closest relatives, especially chimps. Chimpanzees can learn through observational learning, and in fact, many aspects of their society are due to observational learning, such as using tools, for example. It's not a natural thing to take a stick and lick it, put it in a termite mound, and then to get your termite snacks that way. And some chimp cultures will pass on that behavior socially through observational learning, and other chimp cultures will not show that behavior, partly because what is your culture, what is your society, has a lot to do with observational learning and passing on information that way. Some other examples in the animal kingdom would be Saharan desert elephants. They'll have to learn where the watering holes are, and there's no natural way to find them. All they can do is learn by watching the adults and observing how to move from one watering hole to another. Of course, geese, there are lots of explanations for how migrating animals do so. And part of the explanation seems to be simply following adults and observing what landmarks they're tracking. And of course, with chimps as well, just like humans, when you're watching someone behave, especially how to get food, how to open candy, just like a baby chimp, human babies or kids will want to do observational learning, and not only just watch it passively, they'll want to be actively engaged in it. They'll want to be right up close. They'll want to be maybe copying some of those movements as you watch the adult do the behavior of opening up candy or food. And of course, humans as well. There are many situations where we would rather learn through observational learning, right? We could read a book on surfing techniques, but I think most of us would instead rather have the in-person watch somebody do it, and we'll feel we could learn more comfortably and efficiently that way. Another example would be software, learning how to use a computer program. I would personally, and I imagine most of you, would much rather learn through watching someone as opposed to a step-by-step book or handout. Now think about what this means in terms of our brains. There's a lot of research in the last few decades about what are called mirror neurons. And think about how chimps and humans, more than any other animal, have huge cortexes relative to the rest of their brain and relative to their body size. We've identified what a lot of areas of the cortex do, but not at a neuronal level. And when we talk about mirror neurons, it's essentially a neuron that is active when we do the behavior, such as picking up a banana, but also for chimps and humans, it's a neuron that is active when we just observe someone else do the behavior. So what this goes to show us is that we think that observational learning actually takes a big brain, a lot of a cortex, because it's not just mapping out the behavior, it's mapping out the sense of self relative to others to be able to process that behavior just by watching. And so I think part of what makes us human and special is an appreciation for just how complex it can be, how much software and how much hardware in terms of cortical matter we need to be able to do observational learning efficiently. Skinner actually wrote a book called Walden 2 about a utopian society in which if we just use more operant conditioning techniques, we could really control behavior much more than we do today. Most people would say this does not sound like a utopia because we want to have free will, especially as Americans. We can spend our money however we want. Of course, we can think about other societies out there where behavior is strongly controlled. China, North Korea, Singapore, and they have a lot more rewards and especially punishments. And would we want that? Probably not. But there are also some benefits in terms of societal harmony, cleanliness, things like that, that you could argue are useful trade-offs. Most of us probably would not make that trade-off, but Skinner says we underestimate how important these things could be in our lives and how they should factor into our policies. If you've also seen the movie The Truman Show, I recommend it. And in some ways, it takes some of the operant conditioning techniques and it makes a giant Skinner box for Jim Carrey, Truman, the main character. And in fact, they use what's called classical conditioning, we've talked about, so that he never wants to leave this bubble that he doesn't even know he's in. So he's on an island, he thinks, and they've classically conditioned him to be fearful of the water. So each time he feels that something's wrong in his society, that he needs to leave the town, he'll try to get close to the water, and then that classically conditioned fear response will kick in. And of course, there's many of rewards and punishments thrown in there too, trying to control his behavior. And of course, as humans, we think there's something fundamentally wrong with this because it violates our need to express and have free will. Classical and operant conditioning are both variations of associative learning. And here we want to be precise. Even if it's negative, a reinforcer will always increase the rate of responding, and a punisher will always decrease the rate of responding. Let's see if we can pair up our people. Operant conditioning is associated with Skinner, and classical conditioning is most associated with Pavlov. Quick true false as we wrap things up. Skinner is very much associated with operant conditioning. He made his career on it. We often believe that we're better and more likely to learn observationally, but it's important for us to remember that we learn through all of these means, and they're very all important shapers of what we learn and how we behave after that learning. As mentioned earlier, sure, the generalization and discrimination of stimuli that we talked about for classical conditioning also apply just as much to operant conditioning as well. Going back to our basic definition of learning, this is it and true. Direct and immediate reinforcement is the best way to ensure long-term learning. That might sound like the best way, but again, going back to our variable interval, variable ratio especially, doling out of reinforcements and punishers, you'll often see just as strong or stronger behavior if we have variable ratio reinforcement schedules. Think about trying to encourage behavior. Is it all just about operant conditioning? Research shows that Skinner was wrong about that. So much so that if you just reward behavior and punish behavior, and that's the only reason that somebody is engaging in it, then it actually reduces their motivation. So you need to have things like not just the pay for the job. People also care about things like job empowerment. Do I have control over the decisions I make? Do I have some flexibility in what I get to do for my job? And if so, that will increase intrinsic motivation and keep people more likely to be engaged on the job and also to stay on that job. So here we have sort of a complicated study, but I think conceptually it's pretty easy. So they folded in, you can see some colors serving as conditioned stimuli. We're going to ignore the classical conditioning components here and talk about observational learning and related to anticipating pain. You may have heard of a cold pressor task. Essentially, it's dunking a body part, usually a hand, into cold water. The water is so cold that it causes extreme pain, but it's not the pain that will actually cause damage to your skin. So here we have what's the impact of observational learning? Well, half of the group sees a role model performing the task, right? Some models showed extreme pain. Other models were neutral. They just dunked their hand in, had a neutral face, and pulled it back out. So what you can see then is, did that affect whether you had viewed the pain role model or the neutral model? Do the cold pressor task, and then on a scale of 1 to 10 are asked, how painful was that? A 10 being extreme, a 1 being almost none. And not surprisingly, there were differences. Those who saw the pain model thought that the cold pressor task hurt more than the group that saw the neutral model. And what this goes to show is that something that seems only physical, pain, how much did it hurt, has a strong psychological component influenced by observational learning. What this means is that if we want to be good models for our children, that means if we have to go in for a shot or a surgical procedure, we want to be this neutral model so that our kids won't freak out when they have to do something like that in the future. And here's an example of the cold pressor task. You can see it's highly regulated what temperature it is, and you make sure that they aren't keeping their hands in so much that it does cause damage. But most people want to pull out, experience pain that causes them to pull out long before it's likely to cause any damage to their skin. But now we've reached the end of operant and observational learning, and I'd like to discuss many aspects in which we might see these things playing out in our lives. How can we explain how these things work in our lives and the lives of those we know? And knowing that, how can we maybe change our situation, change our environment, so that these things don't hurt us and actually have beneficial effects on our behaviors and the behaviors of those we care about. So looking forward to discussing this and more on the discussions.